We are going to be in Revelation chapters 17 and 18, but as a little side note before that, I wanted to discuss the identity of Babylon, which is discussed in both chapter 17 and 18. So 16, Revelation chapter 16, we had the bowl judgments, and they ended with a loud voice from heaven declaring, "It is done." Mountains were leveled, islands were lost, and 100-pound hailstones fell from the sky. Within God's righteous judgment, a city was mentioned. If you look at verse 19 of chapter 16, it tells us that great Babylon was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. And so in those next two chapters, we see that being played out. The cup of God's wrath being poured out on Babylon. Commentators have often offered several possible interpretations as to who the city of Babylon might refer to. The city itself is in ruins today, so many commentators have concluded that the prophecy must be figurative. Some people have suggested that it may be a revived Roman Empire, or the Roman Catholic Church, or the city of Jerusalem. We're not going to evaluate all of those relevant positions today. What we are going to consider is whether or not it makes sense to simply look at the references to Babylon as a literal Babylon, a revived Babylonian empire. And the reason for doing that is that as a general rule in biblical interpretation, if the literal interpretation makes sense, then we don't want to look to anything else. And so what we want to do is we want to ask the question, is it reasonable to simply interpret these references to Babylon as actual literal Babylon? We know that the city is named multiple times there, as I told you in verse 19 of chapter 16. These next two chapters name Babylon by name multiple times. So there's a clear implication that we're talking about Babylon. But should we interpret that figuratively and say that we're really talking about something else, or should we assume that it really is Babylon? And I want to say two things about that. One, of course, we're going to examine the possibility of that it's talking about a literal Babylon. But even if it's figurative, even if we mean some other thing is going to rise up that is going to be like Babylon, it would be helpful to examine what Babylon is like throughout the Bible. In other words, what does the figure mean if it's figurative? So that's kind of what we're going to look at. We're going to look at a little bit of a history of Babylon in the Bible to understand what we're talking about here in Revelation chapter 17 and 18. So the first thing I wanted to do was to consider the founding of Babylon. You'd have to go all the way back to Genesis chapter 10 to see that. We see the first reference to Babylon. This is in Genesis chapter 10, and it's right after the flood. There's a guy named Nimrod, who is considered the first mighty man. And Nimrod founds several cities, and one of them is a city called Babel. Now, by the way, if you read your English Bible, in Genesis chapter 10, it will refer to that city as Babel. And in later passages in the prophecies in Revelation, it will refer to that city as Babylon. That's exactly the same city. It's definitely the same city. Matter of fact, Babel and Babylon are the same city. One is a transliteration of the Hebrew. The other is a transliteration of the Greek. So if you were reading in Hebrew, you'd see Babel in Genesis 10. You'd also see Babel in Isaiah and all of the other Old Testament prophecies. It would be Babel everywhere. If you were reading in the Septuagint, which is the Greek Old Testament, you'd see Babylon in Genesis 10, you'd see Babylon in Isaiah, you'd see Babylon in the New Testament Greek. I have no idea why in English we transliterated it differently when it's not that way in the original text. But this city here in Genesis 10 and 11 is the exact same city. So the founding of Babylon, we have this story. Most people are familiar with the Tower of Babel, how God had commanded, we know that God commanded Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And then the flood happened in Genesis, starting in 6. But in Genesis 9, when the flood was over, God regave that same command to be fruitful and multiply and to fill the earth. And so Nimrod and the people of the Tower of Babel came together, and they were in direct rebellion against God in saying that that they would not spread out and fill the earth, but that they would stay in one place. And their goal was to build a tower high enough to hold the entire population without spreading out. In fact, their goal was to build a tower whose top is in the heavens. Genesis 11, verse 4. That's a key point we'll come back to. The goal of the Tower of Babel was to build a tower whose top was in the heavens. The tower itself would reach to the heavens. So this was the first time mankind had organized itself for the expressed purpose of rebelling against God. It was also the original one world government. There was only society in this one little spot, and they bound together to corporately rebel against God. Not just individuals doing their own thing, but let's all band together to go against what God has commanded. The Babylonians put themselves in the place of God, worshiping themselves and their own achievements. In response, God confused their languages, driving them apart and forcing them to spread out as he had commanded. I want to look at another time when we see something similar to the confusion at Babylon, happening centuries later during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon. In his day, Babylon was probably the most powerful nation in the world. Not only the most powerful in the world, but the greatest kingdom that had ever been in history at his time, when we read about Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel 4. In the dream, Nebuchadnezzar sees a tree that represents his kingdom. Now this is, I want you to notice this line here. The tree grew and became strong. Its height reached to the heavens and could be seen to the ends of all the earth. We've seen that line, to the heavens, come up twice now. That Babylon was seen as a nation that is so great that its achievements could be seen all over the world. That was the point of saying the tree reached to the height of the heavens, that all over the world you could see it. In Babel, they wanted to build a tower that you could see all over. In Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, he dreamed of a tree that reached to the heavens. Later on, when he is considering his kingdom from the top of his palace, Nebuchadnezzar claims that all of his kingdom is a mark of his great achievements, giving no glory to God. In response to this claim, and in fulfillment of a prophecy by Daniel earlier in the chapter, God causes Nebuchadnezzar to lose his sanity. For 7 years, he lives like a beast, which is the exact same word, that word that is used for beast, is the exact same word used to describe the kingdoms of men later in the book of Daniel. The city of Babylon has always represented a corrupt organization of man, or as John calls it, the mother of harlots. So when we come across that statement in Revelation chapter 17, this is what we're talking about. That Babylon, whether literal or figurative, it represents mankind's corporate rebellion against God, coming together to ignore whatever God has said. The next section I want to talk about, there are a couple of prophecies that are especially relevant here that prophesied the fall of Babylon back in the Old Testament. Now, if you know your history a little bit, you know that Nebuchadnezzar built this huge kingdom, and they were incredibly powerful until the Persians came and overtook Babylon. And from that point on, Persia was the most powerful kingdom in the world, and the city of Babylon gradually fell to ruin. So not all at once, but it gradually fell to ruin. And so what we have in Isaiah 13 and 14, and in Jeremiah 50 and 51, are prophecies about the destruction of Babylon. And what we want to consider is, are those prophecies fulfilled in the historical fall of Babylon that has already happened? Or should we still expect a future fall of Babylon? So Isaiah 13 and 14, Jeremiah 50 and 51 prophesy about a destruction of Babylon. Some interpreters argue that this destruction already happened when Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539 BC. However, there are reasons to believe that the defeat of Babylon could not have been the one Isaiah and Jeremiah had in mind. Let's consider a few things about the destruction they predicted. And I put a note in there that most of what I'm about to say comes from a YouTube video. You can go and look that up. I put the link in there. and see Andy Wood's explanation of these things. But I'll share with you some of the basic points that Andy Woods makes about these things, and I'd like to just take a look at that for a minute here. Number one, Isaiah 13 and 14 predict cosmic disturbances. And I'm going to read this passage to you and listen to it and see if it sounds familiar to you. In Isaiah 13, 10 through 13, it says this: "The stars of heaven and their constellations will not show their light. The rising sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. I will punish the world for its evil, the wicked for their sins. I will put an end to the arrogance of the haughty, and will humble the pride of the ruthless. I will make man scarcer than pure gold, more rare than the gold of Ophir. Therefore I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will shake from its place at the wrath of the Lord Almighty in the day of his burning anger." We've got cosmic disturbances, global judgment, similarity to Sodom and Gomorrah judgment. That's in verse 19. It says, "Babylon, the jewel of kingdoms, the glory of the Babylonians' pride will be overthrown by God like Sodom and Gomorrah." Verses 20 through 22 tell us that it will never be inhabited again. And then chapter 14, verses 5 through 8 tell us that there will be universal peace and rest after Babylon falls, and that Israel will see a regeneration after the fall of Babylon. Now, considering all of that, and trying to put that into Cyrus's fall of Babylon, doesn't really fit so much. When Cyrus overtook Babylon, you did not have the cosmic disturbances. It really wasn't a global event. It really wasn't similar to Sodom and Gomorrah. And in fact, by some historical accounts, the people living in the city of Babylon didn't really even know that they had been overthrown. Cyrus cut off the river that fed into Babylon, and the soldiers marched through the blocked riverbed and walked right in and were already inside the gates, and the people just gave up, and that was it. And they didn't even have to go around and kill all the people. They didn't have to go around and have a huge, massive, dramatic destruction. They were just like, "Hey, we're in charge now." And they're like, "Okay, fair enough. I guess you win. We already lost this if you're inside our walls." And so it wasn't this huge, massive thing that we would expect from Isaiah 13. Although, I know for those that are in this room, it's been a little while since we were looking at Revelation, but if you can remember what we've been talking about in Revelation, that language there in verses 10 through 13 sounds very familiar. It sounds very similar to what we're reading about in the end times. These judgments don't seem to fit with the historical account of the fall of Babylon 539 BC from the Cyrus Cylinder and the writings of Herodotus and the biblical account. It seems that Cyrus overthrew Babylon moderately peacefully. We just went through how he snuck in through the Euphrates River. But it just doesn't seem to fit. And I'll take you to another passage, Jeremiah 50 and 51, that also gives us a prophecy about the fall of Jerusalem that is, I would say, similar to the Isaiah 13 account. But Jeremiah 50 and 51 similarly predict a dramatic fall. Jeremiah predicts a fall that is sudden. Jeremiah 51:8. In the NIV here, that says, "Babylon will suddenly fall and be broken. Wail over her, get balm for her pain. Perhaps she can be healed." The fall is sudden. It's complete in its destruction, so that no one will inhabit it forever. Let me read those verses to you really quick. Chapter 50, verse 3, it says, "A nation from the north will attack her and lay waste her land. No one will live in it. Both men and animals will flee away." We know that Babylon was not uninhabited after Cyrus took over, because Cyrus lived there. Cyrus took over, and his government was still based there. But Jeremiah predicted that it would be uninhabited. Verse 13 says, because of the Lord's anger she will not be inhabited, but will be completely desolate. All who pass Babylon will be horrified and scoff because of all her wounds. Verse 26 says, "Come against her from afar, break open her granaries, pile her up like heaps of grain, completely destroy her, and leave her no remnant." And then verses 39 and 40 say this: "So desert creatures and hyenas will live there, and there the owl will dwell. It will never again be inhabited or lived in from generation to generation. As God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah along with their neighboring towns, declares the Lord, so no one will live there, no man will dwell in it." Commentators argue sometimes that today that is true of Babylon. No one lives there. But it certainly didn't happen when Babylon fell. So what you're doing, if you want to say that the judgment in Jeremiah 50, 51, and the judgment in Isaiah 13 and 14 are talking about the fall of Babylon that already happened, you're kind of making that figurative and saying that these, Jeremiah says it's going to be sudden, but you're saying that sudden means it took about 300 years before the city was actually abandoned. It's a very hard stretch of the text to say that some of these things that Jeremiah and Isaiah said are actually about the fall of Babylon that already happened. Interestingly, other things that Jeremiah predicts, that believers will flee from the fall of Babylon to avoid God's vengeance, that it will result in the restoration of Israel, including a reunification of Israel and Judah, which didn't so much happen after Cyrus took over. We don't see Judah and Israel coming together, and in fact we see the Jews identifying themselves as Jews rather than Israelites. The nation of Judah really took on its own identity after all of that happened. After Babylon and the exile, they came back from the exile, and they identified themselves as Jews and really separated themselves from the Samaritans, who were from the northern kingdom, from Israel. And so they probably were more divided than they had ever been before in the immediate aftermath of Babylon's fall. So that when Jesus comes along, we have the story of the Good Samaritan and several instances in Jesus' life where we see how much the Jews hate the Samaritans and have not united and become one nation. And so these things don't seem to fit. Not only does the fall of Babylon fail to meet the conditions in these two passages, but neither does anything else in history. Babylon was at least somewhat inhabited for centuries after Cyrus conquered it. Israel and Judah certainly didn't unify over its destruction. No worldwide cosmic events occurred, nor was the world judged for the sins of Babylon in that event. It would seem that the destruction of Babylon predicted in these passages remains in the future. So for that reason, we're saying that it seems like whatever Isaiah 13, 14 are saying, whatever Jeremiah 50 and 51 is saying, it's the same thing that Revelation 17 and 18 are talking about. The next clue here is the woman of Zechariah 5. Zechariah tells us about a vision in which an angel shows Zechariah a woman in a basket. The woman is called wickedness. After the angel shows Zechariah the woman, he shuts her back up in the basket, and two winged women carry the basket away. Zechariah asks where the women are going, to which the angel replies, to build a house for it in the land of Shinar. Now the land of Shinar, we didn't look at this in Genesis chapter 10, but that is the same area where it says that the city of Babylon was built. And so this definitely could be, the land of Shinar could be seen as synonymous with the city of Babylon. So these women went to build a house in the land of Shinar. There are several parallels between this passage and Revelation 17 and 18. Both refer to a woman sitting, one in a basket, the other on the beast. Both women are representative of evil. One is called wickedness, the other is called the mother of harlots. One is taken to Babylon, and the other is called Babylon. The land of Shinar is another term for Babylon throughout the Bible. This is particularly interesting because some commentators interpret Isaiah 13 and 14 and Jeremiah 50 and 51 as hyperbolic descriptions of the Babylonian destruction of 539 BC. However, this passage in Zechariah was written after the destruction in 519. So Zechariah cannot be prophesying about a future destruction of Babylon in 519, when the actual destruction of Babylon that other people are saying, Isaiah 13:14 are talking about, had already happened when Zechariah was mentioned. In Zechariah's time, the Babylonian Empire was no longer in power, but the city of Babylon was still fully intact. It seems odd that Babylon would be spoken of figuratively when it still literally existed, and yet it can't be talking about the overthrow of Babylon since that already happened. So these are clues that perhaps what it's talking about when it comes to Babylon is a renewed Babylonian Empire. And this next clue here, the kings of the east. And this takes us back to Revelation chapter 16. In that chapter we saw the sixth bowl. The Euphrates River was dried up. And in fact, let's turn there and read that and remind ourselves of Revelation chapter 16. Starting at verse 12, it says, "The sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up to prepare the way for the kings from the east." Now this river Euphrates, this is the river that runs through Babylon, that was dried up so that Cyrus could come in and invade the city. And these kings are called kings of the east. Now, most of the time, when the Bible talks about something coming from the east, it is often talking about Babylon. Babylon is to the east of Israel. So a lot of times we think, and some commentators read that and think, well, kings from the east were from China. That's what we think of as being the east. And that's pretty far east from Israel. But a closer east of Israel is actually the city and the area of Babylon. It's much simpler to connect this idea of kings from the east with Babylon. One reason is that Babylon is to the east of the Euphrates River, separating Babylon from Megiddo, so it makes good sense for the Euphrates to be dried up to allow the armies to pass through there. Also, the term east often refers to Babylon or that area in the Bible. Genesis 2:8, Genesis 11:2, that's when we're talking about the founding of Babylon. It says that or the city of Babel, it says that they went east to the land of Shinar and built the city of Babel. And according to many commentators, Matthew 2:1, the kings from the east who visited Matthew, many commentators believe that those were from Babylon, although there's a lot of debate about that. Also, when we consider the context, we know that Babylon is in view here, so it makes more sense than to assume we're talking about a nation in this verse that is nowhere else mentioned in the book of Revelation. So if we say that those kings of the east there in chapter 16, verse 12 is China, okay, but we're not talking about China anywhere else. But we are talking about Babylon in this context. We've mentioned the city of Babylon later in this chapter. The next two chapters are talking about Babylon. So it's very likely that these kings of the east are from literal Babylon, from that general area, rather than being from Rome, which is of course not to the east of Israel, or from Jerusalem, which is of course not to the east of Israel because it's in Israel. So looking at that as a literal reference to the city of Babylon as an origin for these armies of the kings of the east that come and attack would make sense and fit fairly easily into the context. So to conclude that, the identity of Babylon in Revelation 17 and 18, we are going to consider in the next part of track 14, Revelation 17 and 18 itself. Clearly it is about Babylon, as verse 5 and several others tell us. Is there an indication in the text that it is really about some other nation? I don't see one. I see specific geographic references in the surrounding context that point to Babylon, such as the Euphrates River in 1612. I see a reference to the mother of harlots, which doesn't make sense with Jerusalem, Rome, or the Roman Catholic Church. We could certainly see any of those as areas that are associated with sin, but certainly the Roman Catholic Church didn't start people in rebellion against God. We had people in rebellion against God long before that church existed. The city of Rome itself, or the Roman Empire, didn't start the idea of rebellion against God. We had rebellions against God long before that. And Jerusalem, of course, didn't start rebellion against God. But Babylon could fit that. Babylon is actually the site of the first time that mankind bonded together to rebel against God. But we can pair ample biblical references to connect that idea of being the mother of harlots with Babylon. I see in chapter 17 and 18 a destruction that is reminiscent of Isaiah and Jeremiah's prophecies that are definitely about Babylon and probably not yet fulfilled. It seems the only reason not to take the reference to Babylon literally is that the city is currently in ruins, but to that I would point out that so is the temple in Jerusalem. It seems likely then to me that Babylon in this context means Babylon. So I think that it is at least a reasonable interpretation to say that we are literally talking about Babylon. Obviously, as time unfolds, we may learn something different, but certainly I hope you can see that the natural sense of that passage seems to be that we're talking about a literal Babylon, and that's what we should expect unless we see evidence of something else.